The morning air inside Galactic University buzzed with nervous energy as students from 12 different worlds gathered in the largest classroom ever built. The room stretched so wide that some species needed special viewing equipment to see the front, and the ceiling rose high enough to accommodate the floating Wispani who preferred to hover rather than sit. Jake Martinez walked into the classroom like he was entering any regular college lecture hall back on Earth. He carried a simple backpack over one shoulder and sipped coffee from a metal travel mug that had seen better days. His casual stride and relaxed posture stood out sharply against the careful, measured movements of nearly every other student in the room. Around him, beings from across the galaxy moved with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. The Kethri students, tall creatures that looked like a cross between praying mantises and ancient warriors, clicked their mandibles in what their species considered respectful silence. Each click was perfectly timed, part of a complex rhythm that showed proper educational humility. Near the center of the room, 3 blobberry students pulsed soft blue and green colors. These gelatinous beings communicated primarily through color changes, and the gentle hues they displayed indicated deep respect for the learning opportunity ahead. They had spent the previous week in meditation, preparing their consciousness for what their culture considered the highest form of intellectual pursuit, the Silinary. Delegation sat in perfect formation near the front rows. These crystalline beings looked like living gemstones, their bodies reflecting light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Each Silinary student wore ceremonial learning crystals around their necks, ancient artifacts passed down through generations of scholars. The crystals were said to enhance understanding and show proper respect for knowledge itself. Behind them, the Mokhtar students looked like massive teddy bears that had learned to walk upright and wear clothes. Despite their cuddly appearance, they were actually one of the most intellectually advanced species in the galaxy. They had braided small prayer ribbons into their fur, each ribbon representing a different aspect of learning they hoped to master during the semester. The Veltari professor organizing the class stood at the front of the room, his 4 arms moving in graceful patterns as he arranged his teaching materials. His crystalline skin caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. Professor Zekthar had spent most of his career studying interspecies education, and this mixed-species biology course represented the culmination of decades of careful planning and diplomatic negotiation. Jake found an empty seat and dropped into it with the kind of casual comfort that comes from years of classroom experience. He pulled out his phone and checked his messages while waiting for class to start. The simple action sent ripples of shock through the nearby alien students, who had never seen anyone treat a learning environment with such informal ease. Katie, Walsh and Ben Foster entered the room a few minutes later, laughing about something that had happened at breakfast. Katie carried a bright pink backpack covered in patches from various Earth bands and tourist destinations. Ben had his textbook shoved into a worn canvas bag that looked like it had survived several wars. The 2 humans made their way over to Jake, completely oblivious to the stunned stares following their progress across the room. They settled into nearby seats with the kind of easy familiarity that comes from years of shared educational experiences. "Did you finish the reading for today?" Katie asked Jake, pulling out a tablet and a stylus. "Most of it," Jake replied, taking another sip of his coffee. The chapter on cellular structure was pretty basic stuff, nothing we haven't covered before. Ben nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it reminded me of intro biology from freshman year. Remember Professor Johnson and those terrible slide presentations?" Their casual conversation about the sacred texts of biological knowledge sent waves of horror through the listening alien students. The Wispani began emitting high-pitched sounds that their translators couldn't properly interpret, while several Kethri students started clicking their mandibles in what appeared to be distress patterns. Professor Zekthar called the class to attention using a series of harmonic tones that resonated differently for each species present. The alien students immediately fell silent and assumed positions of respectful attention. The humans looked up from their conversation with mild interest, the same way they might notice someone turning on a television in another room. Welcome, honored students, to what may be the most significant learning experience of your lives. Professor Zekthar began, his voice carrying the weight of profound ceremony. The universal translators built into each desk rendered his words in appropriate tones for every species, adding layers of reverence and significance that the original Veltari language conveyed naturally. Today marks the beginning of our journey into the deepest mysteries of existence itself, the professor continued, gesturing with all four arms in patterns that held specific meaning for different cultural groups. We shall explore the very foundations of life, the sacred processes that bind all living things together across the cosmos. The alien students responded with a collective intake of breath, or whatever equivalent their species used to express. Awe and anticipation. Some bowed their heads, others changed colors, and a few began emitting subsonic harmonics that indicated deep spiritual preparation. Jake yawned and stretched in his chair, the movement causing several nearby students to gasp audibly. He had no idea that his simple, unconscious action had just violated about 6 different cultural protocols. Regarding proper respect for sacred knowledge, Professor Zekthar lit a ceremonial brazier that filled the room with smoke visible across multiple light spectrums. The smoke was designed to help different species achieve the proper mental state for receiving profound knowledge. For most of the aliens present, this ritual marked the transition from ordinary consciousness to a heightened state of learning readiness. Katie Walsh wrinkled her nose at the smell and quietly asked Ben if he had any gum. The question, whispered during what every other student considered a moment of deep spiritual significance, caused a Blobberry student to cycle through shocked color patterns so rapidly that it looked like a living kaleidoscope. Before we begin our study of biological processes, Professor Zekthar announced, we must prepare our minds and spirits for the responsibility of witnessing life's most intimate secrets. The knowledge we will gain carries with it the weight of cosmic significance. The alien students nodded solemnly, their various appendages, tentacles, and sensory organs oriented toward the professor with laser-like focus. They understood that they were about to embark on something that would fundamentally change their understanding of existence. Jake checked his phone again and noticed he had a text from his roommate asking about dinner plans. He quickly typed back a response while Professor Zekthar continued his opening ceremony. The semester had begun, though none of the humans had any idea they were about to accidentally trigger the biggest educational crisis in galactic history. 3 weeks had passed since the opening ceremony, and the alien students had spent every day preparing themselves for what Professor Zekthar promised would be the most important moment of their academic lives. Today they would finally be allowed to observe actual living cells under microscopes, something that required extensive mental and spiritual preparation. According to every galactic civilization except one, the Selenary students had been fasting for the past week, consuming only special crystalline nutrients that were supposed to purify their consciousness. They believed that looking at living cells with an impure mind could drive a being insane or cause permanent psychological damage. Each Selenary wore their family's ancestral viewing crystals, precious stones that had been passed down through hundreds of generations of their most honored scientists. The Mokhtar delegation had spent the previous night in traditional meditation circles, their massive furry forms arranged in complex geometric patterns while they hummed ancient songs about the sanctity of life. They had braided prayer ribbons into their fur, each ribbon representing a different aspect of cellular function they hoped to understand without losing their minds in the process. The ethereal Wispani floated in slow, hypnotic spirals near the ceiling of the laboratory. Their translucent forms pulsed with soft light as they performed their species' highest form of respect for the mysteries of existence. They had been preparing for this moment since childhood, as their culture considered cellular observation to be the peak of scientific achievement. Even the normally practical Blobberry had spent days cycling through specific color patterns that were supposed to align their consciousness with the sacred rhythms of life itself. They pulsed in perfect synchronization, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if everyone wasn't treating it with such deadly Seriousness. Professor Zekthar moved through the laboratory like he was conducting a religious service. He spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the profound responsibility they were about to undertake. Each microscope had been blessed according to the traditions of multiple worlds, and the slides containing cellular samples were treated like holy relics. Today you will witness the very essence of existence, Professor Zekthar announced, his forearms moving in ceremonial patterns that held deep meaning for every species except the humans. You will gaze upon the fundamental building blocks of all life in the universe. What you see today will change you forever? The alien students trembled with anticipation and fear. Many had spent years preparing for this moment, undergoing psychological conditioning and spiritual training. That was considered essential for maintaining sanity while observing the sacred mysteries of cellular life. Some species required government permits just to attempt such an advanced viewing. Jake Martinez walked into the laboratory, 15 minutes late because he had stopped to get another cup of coffee from the vending machine down the hall. He carried his supplies in a plastic grocery bag and wore the same t-shirt he had slept in. His casual entrance during what every alien considered a moment of profound ceremony sent shocked ripples through the assembled students. "Sorry I'm late," Jake said to Katie and Ben, who had saved him a spot at one of the microscope stations. The coffee machine was being weird again. Several Kethri students fainted immediately. The sight of someone treating this sacred moment with such casual indifference was more than their carefully prepared minds could handle. Their rigid exoskeletons hit the laboratory floor with sounds like breaking dishes, while other Kethri rushed to provide emergency psychological assistance. Professor Zekthar tried to maintain the ceremonial atmosphere despite the growing chaos. He guided the remaining conscious students through a series of purification rituals designed to protect their minds from the psychological trauma of cellular observation. Each step had been carefully developed over centuries of scientific tradition. Jake examined his microscope with the same level of interest he might show for a new smartphone. He adjusted the settings with practiced ease, completely unaware that most species in the galaxy required months of training before they were considered mentally stable enough to operate such equipment. "Okay, everyone ready?" Professor Zekthar asked, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic significance. "Remember, what you are about to see represents the most fundamental mysteries of existence. Approach with reverence and prepare your minds for transformation." The alien students nodded solemnly and began their final mental preparations. Some whispered prayers in their native languages. Others performed breathing exercises that had been passed down through generations of their most honored scholars. The Wispani began emitting harmonious sounds that were supposed to align their consciousness with the universal patterns of life. Jake peered into his microscope eyepiece and immediately brightened up. "Oh, cool, cheek cells," he said to Ben, who was setting up his own slide at the next station. "These look just like the ones we looked at in high school biology. Remember when Mrs. Patterson made us swab our own mouths?" The collective gasp from 37 alien students was loud enough to trigger the laboratory's emergency response system. Several blobberry began cycling through colors so rapidly they looked like living strobe lights. A Wispani student started making sounds that the universal translator could only render as cosmic screaming of infinite terror. 3 more Kethri fainted on the spot, their bodies hitting the floor in sequence like dominoes. The remaining Kethri began making rapid clicking sounds that their translators identified as emergency prayers for the preservation of sanity. "What?" Jake looked up from his microscope, genuinely confused by the chaos erupting around him. "Did I do something wrong? The microscope seems to be working fine." Katie Walsh, completely oblivious to the crisis she was about to make worse, leaned over to look at Jake's slide. "Yeah, those are definitely cheek cells," she confirmed with the casual expertise of someone who had performed this exact same observation dozens of times. "They look just like tiny fried eggs, don't they?" A culinary student made a sound like breaking crystal and collapsed backward into the arms of his classmates. His ancestral viewing crystal fell to the floor and shattered, something that hadn't happened in over 300 years of his family's academic history. Ben Foster called out from the station, Hey guys, remember that time in community college when Professor Williams had us look at pond water? That was pretty gross. All those little things swimming around. The word gross sent the remaining conscious alien students into complete panic. The concept that someone could observe the sacred mysteries of life and describe the experience as gross violated fundamental assumptions about consciousness, sanity, and the nature of existence itself. Professor Zekthar found himself surrounded by fainting students, emergency medical teams, and the growing realization that everything he thought he knew about human psychology was completely wrong. Professor Zekthar struggled to restore order in his laboratory as chaos spread like wildfire through the alien student population. Medical emergency teams rushed between fallen Kethri students while Blawberry counselors tried to calm their fellow students who were still cycling through panic colors. The Wispani had retreated to the highest corners of the room where they floated in distressed patterns that made the air shimmer with their anxiety. The revelation that humans had been casually observing living cells since childhood shattered every assumption the galactic academic community had made about Earth's civilization. For thousands of years, the study of cellular life had been considered the most advanced and dangerous field of biological science, requiring decades of preparation and government oversight. Veltar, a senior culinary student whose family had produced distinguished scientists for over a millennium, managed to speak despite his shock. His crystalline appendages vibrated with disbelief as he addressed Jake directly. "Surely you jest about this high school biology," he said, his translator struggling to convey the appropriate levels of horror and disbelief. "Your species cannot have achieved cellular observation without proper spiritual preparation. The psychological trauma alone would drive most beings to complete madness." Jake looked genuinely confused by the question. He had been trying to help. Professor Zekthar moved some of the fainted students to recovery positions, completely unaware that his casual handling of the situation was making everything worse. "Trauma?" he asked, scratching his head. "I mean, it was pretty boring, actually. Mrs. Patterson made us write a report about what we saw, and most of the class complained because the microscopes were old and hard to focus." A Mokhtar student who had been listening to the conversation made a sound like a dying air conditioner and immediately fell over. His massive furry body hit the laboratory floor with a tremendous thud that shook the equipment tables. Two of his classmates rushed to fan him with their ceremonial prayer ribbons while chanting emergency recovery mantras. Katie Walsh overheard the discussion and laughed in a way that sent chills through every conscious alien in the room. 14 years old, she said, completely missing the growing horror on every non-human face. "We were just kids. Our teacher made us scrape cells from inside our own cheeks and look at onion skin under the microscope. It was pretty gross, honestly." Billy Thompson sneezed on his slide and tried to convince everyone he had discovered a new species. The casual mention of children performing sacred cellular observations sent 3 more Wispani into unconsciousness. They fell from their floating positions like deflated balloons, their translucent forms hitting the floor with soft impacts that somehow sounded more disturbing than the heavy crashes of the larger species. A Blawberry elder who served as the species representative to the university began pulsing urgent red and orange colors. The pattern was so intense it hurt to look at directly, and the universal translator rendered his communication as emergency alert to home world. "Human children perform forbidden knowledge rituals. Request immediate psychological evaluation. Protocols." Ben Foster, who had been quietly observing the growing chaos, decided to try being helpful. "Look, if it makes you feel better, the cell thing was pretty basic compared to what we did later," he said in what he thought was a reassuring tone. "In sophomore year, we had to dissect fetal pigs in anatomy class. And junior year was when we got to work with cow eyeballs and sheep brains." The word dissect hit the remaining conscious alien students like a physical blow. Every species in the galaxy considered the deliberate cutting open of once living tissue to be the most advanced and potentially dangerous form of biological study. Most civilizations required master's degrees, government clearances, and years of psychological conditioning before anyone was allowed to even observe such procedures, let alone perform them. A Kethri student who had just recovered from his earlier fainting spell immediately passed out again. This time he took two of his classmates with him as they tried to catch his falling body. The clicking sounds that emerged from the remaining conscious Kethri were so rapid and panicked that the translation system couldn't keep up, producing only a stream of emergency religious phrases. The Veltari delegation began broadcasting on emergency frequencies to their home world. Professor Zekthar could see the panic in their crystalline features as they tried to explain the impossible situation to their planetary government. How could they report that human teenagers were routinely performing procedures that required the highest levels of scientific clearance on Veltar? But the psychological damage? Stammered another Silinary student whose family crystals were now glowing with stress patterns. How do your young survive the mental trauma of witnessing death and cellular destruction? Do you provide extensive therapy afterward? Katie looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Therapy? For biology class? She asked. Some kids thought it was gross, but most of us were just trying to get a good grade. Sarah Miller was the only one who got really upset, but that was because she was vegetarian and felt bad about the pig thing. Ben nodded in agreement. Yeah, and remember how Mr. Rodriguez always made those weird jokes about the eyeball dissection? He used to call it playing with your food, which was pretty disgusting when you think about it. The casual mention of jokes during sacred biological procedures sent the remaining Blawberry into complete panic mode. They began merging together in what appeared to be a protective formation, their combined mass pulsing through colors that existed beyond the normal spectrum of their emotional communication. Professor Zekthar found himself facing an unprecedented crisis that threatened to destroy thousands of years of carefully established galactic educational protocols. The humans' casual revelations about their educational system were fundamentally challenging everything the galaxy thought it knew about the relationship between consciousness, knowledge, and psychological stability. Emergency communication arrays throughout the university began lighting up as word spread to academic institutions across dozens of worlds. The phrase human biological desecration crisis was already being broadcast on scholarly networks, and Professor Zekthar could see his career flashing before his four eyes. Jake Martinez, completely oblivious to the interstellar incident he had triggered, was still trying to help the medical teams with the unconscious students. Should I call campus security? He asked Professor Zekthar. This seems like a lot of people to faint all at once. Maybe there's a gas leak or something? Within 6 hours of what the galactic news networks were calling the biology lab incident, emergency ships from 17 different worlds had arrived at Galactic University. The fastest communication systems in known space carried word of the crisis across thousands of light years, triggering the largest diplomatic response in the university's 3,000-year history. Jake Martinez sat in a conference room that had been hastily converted into an emergency diplomatic center, surrounded by beings who looked at him with expressions he couldn't begin to interpret. Some seemed horrified, others appeared fascinated, and a few looked like they were suffering from some kind of traumatic stress. He sipped a soda from the vending machine and wondered why everyone was making such a big deal about a simple biology class. Katie Walsh and Ben Foster sat beside him, equally confused by the massive response their casual conversations had triggered. Katie was checking her social media while Ben played a game on his phone, completely unaware that their every movement was being recorded and analyzed by xenopsychologists from across the galaxy. Ambassador Dexla of the Veltari Communion stood before a massive holographic display that showed Earth's educational curriculum in painful detail. The information had been gathered from public sources on Earth's internet, and each new revelation sent fresh waves of shock through the assembled alien delegates. According to our analysis, Ambassador Dexla announced to the packed conference room, human children begin observing cellular structures at an average age of 14 Earth years. This corresponds to an age when most of our species are still learning basic motor functions and require constant supervision to prevent psychological damage. A collective shudder ran through the alien delegation. The Mokhtar representative, A massive furry being wearing ceremonial robes of academic achievement raised a trembling paw. But surely these are only the most gifted individuals selected from millions and given years of preparation. Dr. Susan Hayes, the human cultural liaison who had been emergency transported from Earth's diplomatic corps, shook her head. Actually, it's standard curriculum for all students. Biology is a required class in most American high schools. Every student takes it whether they want to or not. The Wispani delegate began making sounds that the universal translator could only render as sounds of infinite cosmic despair. 3 medical teams rushed to provide emergency psychological support while other Wispani tried to prevent their representative from floating into a complete catatonic state. Elder Morguth of the Sillinary High Council, whose crystalline form had been flickering with stress patterns since his arrival, managed to speak through his shock. But how do they maintain their sanity? Our greatest scholars require decades of psychological conditioning before they can witness the sacred mysteries of life without suffering complete mental breakdown. We have entire universities dedicated to preparing minds for basic cellular observation. Dr. Hayes pulled up another section of Earth's educational data on the holographic display. For humans, biology is simply natural science. Our children are naturally curious about how things work. We encourage hands-on learning and direct observation because we believe experience is the best teacher. Hands-on learning, repeated the blobberry representative, his form cycling through colors that didn't exist in normal emotional communication. They physically manipulate the sacred mysteries of existence with their appendages? Well, yes. Dr. Hayes replied, not understanding why this was causing such distress. Students use tools like scalpels and forceps to examine specimens. They take apart organisms to see how the different systems work together. It's considered essential for understanding basic anatomy. A Kethri delegate immediately collapsed, his exoskeleton hitting the conference table with a sound like breaking pottery. The remaining Kethri began making rapid, clicking sounds that the translators identified as emergency prayers for the preservation of universal sanity. Ben Foster, who had been quietly listening to the discussion while trying to beat his high score in a puzzle game, finally looked up from his phone. Yeah, how else would you learn about stuff? He said with the tone of someone stating the obvious. In my high school anatomy class, we had this plastinated human body that you could take apart layer by layer. Mr. Rodriguez used to joke that it was like a really expensive Lego set, except you could see all the organs and stuff. The mention of a human body being treated like a toy construction set sent the Mokhtar delegate into immediate psychological collapse. His massive form slumped in his chair while 2 medical teams rushed to provide emergency mental health support. Other Mokhtar in the room began humming what sounded like funeral dirges. Dr. Hayes tried to provide context. The plastinated specimens are preserved human bodies donated for educational purposes. It's considered a great honor to contribute to science education after death. Students learn anatomy by directly examining real human organs and systems. They desecrate their own species for educational purposes, whispered a Sillinary observer, his crystalline form now pulsing with patterns that indicated complete psychological overload. And they consider this honorable. Jake Martinez, who had been wondering when this meeting would end so he could get back to his dorm for dinner, decided to try being helpful. Look, I know it sounds weird, but it's really not that big a deal, he said in what he thought was a reassuring tone. My little sister is taking a P-biology this year, and she's only 16. Last week she texted me pictures of the sheep brain they were dissecting. She thought it was pretty cool. The revelation that 16-year-old humans were performing procedures that required advanced degrees and government clearances on most worlds triggered a fresh wave of diplomatic panic. Emergency communications began flooding the conference room as representatives contacted their home governments to report this impossible development. Ambassador Dixla called for an emergency recess as 3 more delegates required immediate psychological intervention. The Galactic Council had called an emergency session to address what they were now officially terming the human educational impossibility crisis. Dr. Hayes found herself trying to explain to increasingly bewildered alien representatives that, What they considered impossible was actually considered normal educational practice on Earth. She showed them video footage of children conducting simple experiments, students performing dissections in classroom settings, and university laboratories where undergraduates routinely handled procedures that would require master's-level clearances on alien worlds. The aliens watched in horrified fascination as human teenagers casually manipulated biological specimens, made jokes during serious scientific procedures, and treated the fundamental mysteries of life like routine homework assignments. Each new piece of evidence challenged thousands of years of galactic assumptions about the relationship between knowledge, consciousness, and psychological stability. The diplomatic crisis surrounding human educational practices forced the Galactic Council to completely rebuild their understanding of Earth civilization over the course of several intense weeks. What had initially appeared to be barbaric disregard for the sacred mysteries of life slowly transformed into recognition of an entirely different philosophical approach to understanding the universe. Dr. Susan Hayes spent 8-hour days in continuous diplomatic meetings, explaining human scientific methodology to increasingly bewildered alien representatives who struggled to comprehend how any species could survive such casual exposure to biological knowledge. She showed them video after video of Earth's educational system, each demonstration adding new layers to what the aliens were beginning to call the human impossibility. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes presented footage of a kindergarten class observing caterpillars transform into butterflies. The alien delegates watched in stunned silence as 5-year-old humans giggled and pointed at chrysalises, completely unaware they were witnessing one of the most profound biological processes in existence. The key difference, Dr. Hayes explained, to the packed assembly hall is that humans don't view scientific observation as a spiritual or religious act. For us, the universe is something to be understood through investigation and experimentation, not worshipped from a distance. Ambassador Thexla, who had spent the previous week in intensive psychological therapy just to process the human educational revelations, raised a trembling appendage. But how do your young minds survive the direct exposure to life's fundamental processes without protective spiritual barriers? Because we don't see them as dangerous, Dr. Hayes replied simply. To humans, biology is just another subject like mathematics or history. We teach children that curiosity is natural and that asking questions about how things work is good. The concept sent ripples of amazement through the alien assembly. For thousands of years, galactic civilization had approached scientific knowledge with layers of ritual, preparation, and psychological protection. The idea that someone could simply look at biological processes without elaborate safeguards challenged the foundation of how most species understood consciousness itself. Professor Zekthar, who had finally recovered enough from his psychological consultation to return to work, stood before his colleagues with a revolutionary proposal. Perhaps, he said carefully, we have been approaching biological education incorrectly. What if the humans have discovered something we missed? The suggestion was so radical it triggered emergency sessions in academic institutions across 17 worlds. The Veltari published a groundbreaking research paper titled The Human Paradox: Sacred Knowledge Through Profane Methods, which argued that humanity's casual approach to biological sciences had actually accelerated their understanding of life by thousands of years compared to species that approached the same subjects with religious reverence. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Despite their apparently reckless educational methods, humans had made remarkable advances in biological sciences. They had mapped their own genetic code, developed sophisticated medical procedures, and achieved scientific breakthroughs that had taken other species centuries longer to accomplish. Dr. Hayes presented the assembly with examples of human scientific achievements that had been accomplished by individuals who started their biological education as children. She showed them research conducted by scientists who had begun dissecting specimens in high school, performed cellular observations as teenagers, and treated biological experimentation as routine academic work. What you consider spiritual desecration, she explained, we consider normal learning. This difference in approach may actually be why humans have made such rapid progress in understanding biological systems. The revelation triggered the largest academic revolution in galactic history. University systems that had operated unchanged for millennia suddenly found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about education, consciousness, and the nature of knowledge itself. Professor Zekthar proposed the first experimental program, designed to test human-style biological education on volunteer alien students. The proposal was so controversial it required approval from the highest levels of galactic government, but the potential implications were too significant to ignore. The first volunteers were carefully selected from the youngest and most psychologically stable students from each species. Under extensive supervision and with emergency psychological support teams standing by, they began attempting what the program officially called direct observational biology, but what everyone privately referred to as human-style learning. The results exceeded every expectation. Alien students who had spent years in theoretical preparation began making practical discoveries within weeks of adopting human educational methods. A young culinary student who had been afraid to look directly at cellular structures suddenly found himself confidently identifying different types of tissue under microscopic examination. The Mokhtar delegation reported that their volunteers were making connections between biological systems that had previously taken their species decades to understand. Even the ethereal Wispani found that direct observation enhanced their naturally superior pattern recognition abilities in ways their traditional meditative approaches had never achieved. Jake Martinez, Katie Walsh, and Ben Foster became the most studied humans in galactic history without ever realizing it. Xenopsychologists analyzed their every casual comment about Earth's educational system, trying to understand how their species had developed such remarkable psychological resilience to what other civilizations considered traumatic knowledge exposure. The semester continued with Professor Zekthar implementing what he carefully called modified human pedagogical approaches in his advanced classes. Alien students began performing simple cellular observations without extensive spiritual preparation, guided by human volunteers who treated the entire process with encouraging casualness. Jake submitted his final project on cellular mitosis without any awareness that it represented a revolutionary document in galactic educational theory. His paper included casual observations about cellular division patterns that had taken Veltari scientists centuries to discover, presented with the same level of excitement he might show for a particularly interesting video game. In his conclusion, Jake wrote that he had enjoyed the class and was looking forward to next semester's advanced genetics course, where Professor Zekthar had mentioned they would be playing around with DNA and stuff. The casual reference to genetic manipulation as recreational activity sent the professor into another round of psychological consultation. The Galactic University quietly implemented new safety protocols for any courses involving human exchange students, while simultaneously establishing the galaxy's first applied human scientific methodology program for alien volunteers willing to challenge 10,000 years of scientific tradition. Jake, Katie, and Ben returned to Earth for winter break, completely unaware that they had accidentally revolutionized galactic education and established humanity's reputation as the universe's most casually terrifying scientists. They planned to spend their vacation catching up on Netflix and complaining about their upcoming organic chemistry class, which they had heard was supposed to be really difficult.